Friends, have we humans forgotten one another? Tell me, in our busyness, our fear, our judgments, our desperation, have we forgotten we belong to one another? Have we forgotten how to love one another? How to see the sacred spark of creation in each other's eyes? Have we become so righteous and sure of ourselves as to think we do not need one another to survive? Or that we are smart enough on our own accord? Turn to one another, writes author, activist, and leader Margaret Wheatley. We must turn to one another and see. Finally, see. And so I invite you to turn to someone. If you're here in the sanctuary, turn to whoever is closest to you. If you're sitting some distance apart, which is likely, turn and maybe bridge the gap with eye contact. If you're online, turn to someone. If they're with you, if you're alone, pick up a photograph, look out the window. Or close your eyes and allow a person to come to your mind. Turn, pause, and look. Look beyond your discomfort. You're feeling silly or concerned you are doing this wrong. Look beyond your certainty that you already know this person at whom you are looking, or your sadness that you don't know this person. Look at this person and see their beauty. Imagine the warehouse of riches they have inside them. This person at whom you are looking or remembering carries a lifetime of experiences, dreams, and questions. Like you, they have felt sad, exuberant, and at times lost in their life. Like you, they question, they wonder, and hypothesize. Like you, they hurt, they bleed, and they love. Now bow to that person and turn to another person in the sanctuary or in your heart. See their face as best as you are able. Notice something perhaps you have not noticed before. Drawing on generous listening, Marilyn Nelson's beautiful poem that Nancy read, look at this person and ask yourself, who is this miracle looking at me? What do I not know about this person? What might we teach one another? And now bow to that person and bring your awareness back to yourself. Take a moment to center yourself, maybe placing your hands in your lap, one palm cupping the other. Take a breath. Thank yourself. You just took a leap of faith, connecting with another person, even without speaking. It takes awareness and courage to slow down, to interrupt our thinking that we know one another, and to instead ask questions about who it is we see. Krista Tippett calls this moving away from the false refuge of certitude. It's vulnerable to see one another, and it's brave. It is vulnerable to turn to one another, and it is essential for meaningful conversation. If you were to ask yourself one question about conversation and what it really means, or how do we know if we've engaged or are engaging in authentic conversation, I personally, this is just my own experience, the question I ask myself is, have I been changed? Am I willing to be changed? Am I willing to enter into a conversation with a person, a stranger, a family member? It's all the same. Am I willing to enter into that conversation, vulnerable and brave enough to possibly change? If no other way, we change by virtue of having the experience that is now part of the repertoire of our memories. Or do we move along on automatic pilot? Or do we tune others out? Or do we enter into conversations so sure we are right? Is my purpose in the conversation to prove someone else wrong? Protect myself? It's vulnerable and it's brave to turn to one another. We have many opportunities at church to do this. And I think it's one of the many, many, many gifts of being part of this community, is we get to practice. Whether you're in a chalice circle, coming to a sermon discussion this afternoon, greeting one another outside after the service, coming to tell me that you don't understand why the order of services are not printed anymore. See how I sneak these things in there? There are so many opportunities to have conversations. I am changed all the time. It's easier in certain circumstances, of course. It matters. It matters. It matters that we hear one another. And we don't have to agree. The purpose of conversation is to learn, to be changed, to connect, to have a deeper understanding and an appreciation. It isn't necessarily that we have to come to an agreement. It isn't necessarily that we're going to prove we're right. None of that. By the way, before I go on, the order of services are online, mostly from COVID's perspective and seeking to have as safe of a space as we can with less things handed out. The other thing we realize, as is actually what happens when we begin to think of things new, is that it saves hundreds, potentially more than a ream of paper every Sunday, and the ink that goes on to that. So we do have copies available if you need them. However, it does support our commitment to climate justice as well as a safe environment as much as possible. In her book, Turning to One Another, Margaret Wheatley writes about this need and her belief that conversation holds the promise of what we need right now in this world. She also writes about the deep loss that accompanies forgetting to turn to one another. She writes, and I read this as a quote, "We promise each other and we promise ourselves everything except each other." We promise ourselves everything except each other. We've forgotten the true source of contentment and well-being, which is, of course, each other. Martin Buber, Jewish scholar, philosopher, and activist, highlights the need for this genuine connection and conversation and wrote, "Human life and humanity comes into being in genuine encounters. The hope for this hour depends upon the renewal of the immediacy of dialogue among human beings." In his seminal work, I and Thou, Buber wrote about the necessity of connecting with other people in their sacredness as they are, rather than objectifying them. This kind of seeing moves from the I-it relationship, characteristic of capitalistic and materialistic thinking, wherein literally we treat the other person as an object, not consciously. But ask yourself, do you see and interact with the sacredness inside every person? Do you experience them as a thou? Do we recognize each person has things to offer? The wisdom and intelligence that emerges from that kind of an encounter is always greater than the sum of the individuals involved. Always. And many believe that greaterness, that's the divine. In other words, that's what's holy. It's what emerges from people coming together. Wheatley writes, "I believe we can change the world if we start listening to one another again." I am sure that we all agree with that on paper, and yet, do we listen? Yes, I'm sure we do, and I imagine we can do better. I know we can. I know I certainly can. And there are many things that deter us from listening better. I could have many sermons about this. I would say, this is not what I'm about to say, but I believe that underneath it all is fear. The primary reason we stop listening is because we are afraid. We are afraid that we can't change what's happening in the larger world. We are afraid that the grandchildren we love or the people we love will fall victim to this. We are afraid that if I speak my truth, I will be ostracized. We are afraid that I may have to change a perception of myself. Another thing that keeps people from listening, all of us, is what is called a difficult conversation, and that's where I want to spend a couple of minutes. Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen from the Harvard Negotiation Project define difficult conversations as this: any time, any conversation in which we feel vulnerable or our self-esteem is implicated, when the issues at stake are important and the outcome is uncertain, when we care deeply about what is being discussed and about the people with whom we are discussing it. So a difficult conversation changes for each person, and it runs the whole gamut of, again, climate change, politics, to something like, where are we going to meet after church, right? The authors say that there are three conversations happening underneath the surface of any difficult conversation, though they are rarely explicitly included in the words being spoken. I call these sub-conversations. There are three of them. First, underneath what we're actually saying to each other is this conversation in each person's mind. I want to know what happened. We are intent on figuring out the facts. What happened? The second is feelings. We are all having feelings. And the third is about our sense of identity. How is this conversation interacting with who I think I am? So awareness of these conversations, including our contribution to them and blind spots, is what can transform a difficult conversation into a transformative conversation. To do so, however, we must be willing to be changed. So bring to your mind a difficult conversation in your life, maybe one you're avoiding, one that is on the schedule for this week, or one that recurs on a regular basis. And hold that in your mind as I briefly touch on each of these sub-conversations, and think about, from these perspectives, how they might be influencing this difficult conversation. The first sub-conversation, what happened? Every person involved in a conversation has their own understanding about what happened. And if we're not careful, we assume other people have the same understanding that we do. I think I've shared here how my spouse and I had a different understanding in Washington, D.C. of which Starbucks we were going to meet at. So half a day later, was either of us wrong? Or did we just not check it out? We often move forward too often without clarifying each other's understandings. And included in this what happened conversation are also tendencies to assign blame. Who was right? Who was wrong? And attribute to other people their intentions. When in fact we know rarely is any one person to blame. Almost always everyone contributes to the situation, with exceptions, and has some part to play in what transpired. Another important thing to remember and recognize is that when we don't know someone else's intention, research shows that we will assign a negative intention to them. We don't want to think that's true, but it's true. If we don't know what somebody else is actually intending, we will assume the worst. The authors of Difficult Conversations say that difficult conversations are not about getting the facts right. That's not what makes those conversations difficult. It's about conflicting perceptions, interpretations, and values. The other thing to say about intentions is that often we don't even understand our own intentions, and other people don't understand theirs, because intentions are complex. They're layered. They're often contradictory. Inside of ourselves, we have two conflicting intentions happening at the same time. Which leads us to the second sub-conversation about feelings. And they write, difficult conversations don't just involve feelings, they are at their very core about feelings. So being honest about our feelings in a difficult conversation is often the last thing we want to do. And yet, avoiding our feelings makes red herrings out of issues and distracts us from being able to actually talk about what can be done. The third sub-conversation, the one that I personally find the most compelling, is the identity sub-conversation. Underneath what each person is saying aloud in this kind of conversation, they're also asking themselves, including us, all the time, what does this conversation say about me and who I think I am? And where it goes, what might that say about who I think I am? What does it mean to ourselves about our perceptions of ourselves as a parent, or a progressive liberal, or a tolerant person? What if I'm not as tolerant as I think I am? So we lose this wisdom of group learning and decrease our ability to change when we avoid difficult conversations or don't address these underlying sub-conversations. Again, Margaret Wheatley writes, when we humans don't talk to one another, we stop acting intelligently. When we humans stop talking to one another, we stop acting intelligently. Authentic conversation is messy. It takes time. It's vulnerable, and it's brave. And it is essential for change. So I'll close by asking the same questions I did at the start. Have we forgotten, as humans, one another? Have we forgotten we belong to one another? Have we forgotten how to love one another? How to see the sacred spark of creation in each other's eyes? Have we become so righteous, so sure of ourselves, as to think we do not need one another, or that we are smart enough on our own accord? We must turn to one another. Amen, and blessed be.